In the years following World War I, Woodrow Wilson said, "The world must be kept safe for democracy." Wilson didn't want any future world wars, so he came up with this thing called the 14 Points. In it, he advertised the idea of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an organization created after the First World War to stop future wars from happening. So it seems like a good idea, right? Well, no. Congress is like, Wilson, we don't like this, and we don't like you, because we're on the other side. We're the Republicans, and we don't like you Democrats. So you guys suck. So Wilson decided to go on a cross-country road trip around the US to tell the American people to tell Congress to stop being a bunch of dumbos McDumdums. Yeah, that's right, I just said that. And he pushed for the treaty to be ratified. But then he had a stroke. I don't know about you guys, but after having a stroke, I'd get really mad and just want to go home. So that's exactly what Wilson did. At around this time, the 1920 election season was happening. Former President Teddy Roosevelt was hoping to run for a third non-consecutive term for the Republicans. But then he died of a heart attack, so that didn't happen. The Republicans ended up choosing Warren G. Harding, and the Democrats chose James M. Cox for their side. Harding ended up winning the election by 60% of the vote, and James cried. Harding was inaugurated on March 4th, 1921. Harding made it his motto to return to normalcy. What does that mean? Well, it means to go back to the times before World War I, before everything went that way. You see, after World War I, the economic boom of the war was totally gone. There was too much inflation. There were higher taxes. And Harding knew he had to fix it. He was like, guys, I got this. I'll take care of it. Harding had a kind-hearted nature, and he was a fun guy to be around. Look at him. He played the sousaphone. Harding also made a treaty that reduced the navy arms of the world. There's nothing stopping this guy. Unless it's death, then he's totally gonna be stopped. So Harding died on August 2nd, 1923 due to a heart attack. The American people were shocked, but they later found out about a scandal during his administration known as Teapot Dome. Harding hired this guy named Albert Falls, and he was a filth and disgusting, and I just hate the guy. So Harding hired Falls to have control of oil reserves. Fall took advantage of it by leasing the oil rights to oil companies in exchange for bribes like the rat he was. Fall was found out, and he was accused, and he served 1 year in prison. And it left a permanent scar on the Harding presidency. Harding was loved for his time, but his successor Calvin Coolidge was even more loved. Coolidge succeeded Harding, and what did he do for the country? Well, nothing. So you have here is a guy sitting at his chair, sitting there, vetoing bills, not passing bills, somehow lowering taxes, have an economic boom for a decade, and just doing nothing. Now, Coolidge wasn't exactly a perfect president. He didn't really help out farmers. He was also hands-off business, which can be good, and it could also be bad, because for that time, things were pretty good. But there comes a point where things might go downhill, and something bad might happen. You see what I'm getting at? Because some bad thing may happen in the future involving the stock market.
Stock prices, one man declared, have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. And then the bottom fell out.
It's pretty big. So the 1924 election came to America's footstep. There was a knock on the door. America opened the door, and there was Coolidge, a Democrat named John W. Davis, and some other guy nobody cares about. And America took Coolidge in for his own term. During his second term, Coolidge renounced war across the world. He also gave rights to Native Americans. So it would be logical to run for president in 1928, right? Since everybody loves you? Coolidge made a shocking announcement in 1928. I do not choose to run in 1928. Just in case you didn't understand his brilliant way of speaking, he told the American people he didn't want to run in the election of 1928. The nominee for the Democratic side was Al Smith. The nominee for the Republican side was Herbert Hoover. The Republicans were seen as the prime cause of the economic boom of the 20s, so Hoover won in a landslide, and Smith cried.
Hoover was arguably a worse president than Harding or Coolidge. His presidency started with the American people's belief that he would be a good, strong president, but soon after the stock market crash of 1929, those beliefs were soon nowhere to be found. He focused on large businesses more so than the individual. He led a campaign to convince businesses to keep their wages up in order to keep consumers purchasing goods, but this campaign failed miserably. Although Hoover promised the public that the U.S. government would intervene, Hoover did little to help. Hoover believed that the government should interfere as little as possible with private matters such as business. He was devoted to the country's budget, and because of this, was unwilling to spend large sums of money to bail out banks. By 1931, Hoover was hated by the public, and his image was hurt even worse by other politicians. They said that Hoover was a cold, cruel man that was unwilling to help the poor. This was untrue, though. Hoover did supply food for many of the poor. In 1932, Congress passed the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, but Hoover's administration did everything that they could in their power to limit its impact. Hoover believed that a huge work relief program might be as demoralizing as a dole. Hoover was also against his opponent FDR's New Deal, which required the government to spend an unprecedented amount of money.
That'd be great.
One of the biggest flaws in Hoover's presidency, though, was his handling of the Bonus Army March on Washington, D.C. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans that wanted to get their bonus immediately, instead of 1945. Because of the hard, difficult times, they needed the money now. Congress refused to pay them in advance, and after the Bonus Army refused to leave, Washington police attempted to move them by force. They were soon outnumbered and killed 2 protesters. By now the military had moved on to Washington, D.C. General MacArthur refused to listen to Hoover and decided to remove the group by force. Hundreds of civilians were injured, on top of the 2 protesters that were killed by the police. Because of all these factors, Hoover was deeply hated by the public, and he lost in a landslide to FDR in 1932. FDR eventually helped get the United States out of the Great Depression, arguably more so than Hoover did, and helped many more Americans along the way. And although many Americans will argue that FDR increased the national debt significantly, by the end of his term the national debt was only at 1.67%, and that at the beginning of Hoover's presidency was around 0%. So it was a very marginal increase, and he did a lot more and helped a lot more Americans, at least I think. Although Hoover's policies did little to help with the Great Depression, he did more than any other president had done before him.